She was standing close enough to hear him say the vows. That was the part she had not prepared for. She had prepared for the dress. She had prepared for the flowers and the organ and the sound of 200 people rising to their feet at once. What she had not prepared for was that the church was small enough and quiet enough that when the man she had been married to for 22 years turned to another woman and promised to love her until death, Nora Callahan heard every single word of it in his own voice. And she did not cry. She did not make a sound. She stood in the shadow of the last pew, in a gray coat, with her hands folded in front of her, and she listened to her husband marry her cousin. There were 206 people in that church on the morning of October the 14th. The groom, the bride, Nora's own daughter, 20 years old, sitting in the second row in a navy dress, holding a program with her father's name printed on it. Her old neighbors, her old friends, the woman who used to cut her hair, and every single one of them, without exception, believed that Nora Callahan had been dead for 14 months. They believed it because they had gone to her funeral. They had stood in the rain at Mount Carmel Cemetery. They had watched her husband weep so hard at the lectern that 2 men had to help him down from it. They had put their hands on his shoulder afterward and told him that time would help. 14 months earlier, on a night in October when the rain had turned to ice, Nora Callahan's car had gone off the causeway on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. It went through the surface at somewhere close to midnight. Her husband told the police he had gotten out of the vehicle to check a noise, that the car had rolled, that he had run for 1.5 miles to find a signal. Divers worked the water for 9 days. They found the car. They found her purse. They found 1 shoe. They never found her. And in the end, the county did what counties do when a lake keeps what it takes. They issued a certificate. There was a funeral. There was a headstone with her name cut into it. There was an $800,000 insurance policy that paid out in the second week of January. And there she was, standing in the back of a church, breathing, watching her cousin, the girl she had raised, the girl whose mother's funeral she had paid for, the girl who had slept on a cot in the back of Nora's bakery when she was 11 years old and had nowhere else on earth to go, walk down an aisle in white and take her husband's hands. Now, I want you to hold on to something, because it matters more than anything else I am going to tell you today. Nora Callahan was not there to say goodbye. She was not there for closure, or for grief, or for one last look at the life that had been taken from her. She was there for a reason, and she was working. There was a man standing behind her. He was maybe 8 feet back, near the doors, in a dark coat, with his hands folded the same way hers were. He was not looking at the altar. He was not looking at the bride, or the groom, or the flowers, or the daughter in the second row. He was looking at Nora. He had been looking at her, in one way or another, for 14 months. He was the man who had pulled her out of that water at 2 in the morning when her body temperature had dropped low enough that the hospital would have listed her as a fatality on arrival. He was the man who had hidden her. He was the man who had fed her and taught her and spent more than a year showing her exactly how to do what she was about to do that morning. He was not a friend. He was not a lawyer. He was not a policeman. And he was not a witness, and he was not, whatever you may be assuming right now, a man who was in love with her. His name was Kedzie Avenue, and in the city of Chicago there were perhaps 9 people who could have told you what he looked like. He had never been photographed. He had never been convicted. He had never, in 31 years, been in the same room as a person who was willing to say his name out loud to a federal agent. And on the night he found Nora Callahan half frozen on the rocks below the causeway, before he called anyone, before he even took off his coat, he had crouched down in front of her and told her the truth, that she was going to live, that she was going to disappear, and that from that moment forward she belonged to him. Now, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened in the 90 minutes after that ceremony ended is going to be difficult to believe. In 90 minutes, a $94 million company was going to be emptied to the floorboards. In 90 minutes, a man in a rented tuxedo was going to be taken out of his own wedding reception in handcuffs, with cake still on the table. In 90 minutes, a bride was going to learn that the signature she had just put on a marriage certificate, the one she had practiced, the one she had been waiting 3 years to write, had made her the legal owner of every crime her new husband had ever committed. And a detective named Ruth Vega, 6 months from her pension, who had been told to let this go 4 separate times, was going to sit in her car in a parking lot and finally understand that for 14 months she had been chasing the wrong person entirely. But none of that is the reason I am telling you this story. I am telling you this story because of a question that nobody in that church thought to ask. Every person in that building thought they knew what they were looking at. A widower moving on. A young woman in love. A tragedy gently closing. And every single one of them was wrong, in the same direction, at the same time. So here is the question, and I want you to carry it with you, because it is the only one that actually matters. Everyone assumed the woman in the back of that church was the one who had been trapped, the one who had been erased, the one who had been taken. She had. For 22 years, but not by the man you think, and not in the way you think, and not on the night the car went into the water. It happened long before that, slowly, politely, without a single raised voice, in a house in Winnetka with good light and quiet rooms. And I promise you, by the time we are finished, you are going to recognize how it was done. Because it is done to women every day, and almost none of them get a night on a lake to find out. So stay with me. Everything you are about to assume in the next 10 minutes, about the wife, about the husband, about the cousin, about the criminal standing at the back of that church in a dark coat, is going to be wrong. Her name was Nora Callahan. She was 46 years old. And this is the story of the 14 months the world spent believing she was gone. To understand what happened in that church, you need to understand 3 things. I want you to hold on to all 3, because we are going to come back to every one of them, and the last one is going to stay with you tonight. Here is the first. Grant Callahan was worth $94 million on the morning he got married for the second time. He owned a tower on the near north side with his name cut into the glass above the entrance. Every article ever written about that man called him self-made. I have read all of them. Not a single one mentions where the first $400,000 came from. Not one journalist ever asked. And the reason nobody asked is the same reason nobody looked twice at the woman in the back pew. Some people are simply easier not to see. Here is the second thing. Vivian Marsh married her cousin's husband 14 months after the funeral. Now, 14 months is fast. 14 months is the kind of fast that makes an aunt lean over at Thanksgiving and say something she regrets. But that is not the strange part, and it is not what I want you looking at. Because when investigators finally pulled the marriage license application from the Cook County Clerk's office, they found a date on it. The application had been filed 11 days after Nora Callahan's car went through the ice. 11 days. The divers were still in the water. The search had not been called off. There was a boat on Lake Michigan that morning with 4 men on it, dragging the bottom for a body. And 41 miles away, a woman was standing at a counter, filling out a form, planning a wedding. And here is the third thing, and this is the one I need you to sit with. Kedzie Beck did not do favors. I want to be precise about this, because it is easy to hear the word criminal and imagine a man with a temper. That was not him. In 31 years in the city of Chicago, no one has ever been able to name one single thing that Kedzie Beck did that did not, in the end, profit him. He did not have friends. He had positions. He did not have arguments. He had outcomes. He owned 3 hotels, 2 restaurants, a linen service, and the quiet portion of a construction union, and he had never once in his life been photographed for a newspaper. So when a man like that pulls a half-drowned housewife from Winnetka out of Lake Michigan at 2 o'clock in the morning, when he does not call an ambulance, when he does not call the police, when he carries her 41 miles to a house in Albany Park and puts her in a bed and sits in a chair by the door and watches her breathe until the sun comes up, when he then keeps her alive and hidden and silent for 426 days, while her own daughter sits in a dormitory 2 states away, believing her mother is at the bottom of a lake. The only question that matters, the only one, is this. What was she worth to him? 3 questions. Whose money built that tower? Why did Vivian not wait? And what a woman like Nora Callahan was worth to a man like Kedzie Beck? I am going to answer all 3. And I will tell you now, before we go a step further, that the third answer is not the one you are expecting. And it is not the one Nora was expecting either. She lived in that man's house for over a year. She ate at his table. She learned everything she knew from him. And she did not find out why he saved her until it was almost too late to matter. But we cannot start at the lake. We have to start 25 years before the lake, on a street called Kedzie Avenue, on the northwest side of Chicago, in a room that smelled like butter and burned sugar at 4 o'clock in the morning. Because there is a photograph from 1998 that I have looked at more times than I can count. It is not a good photograph. It is slightly out of focus, taken on a disposable camera, and in it there is a young woman standing behind a glass case in an apron, laughing at something off to the left. She is 26 years old. She has flour on her forearms all the way to the elbow, and she looks, and I mean this in the most ordinary and most important way, she looks completely unremarkable happy. Her name then was Nora Whitfield. Her father had been a beat cop in the 25th District for 29 years, a man who worked nights and slept badly, and never once in his life said the word love out loud to anybody. He died in 1997, at 58, in a hospital bed, of a heart that had simply been used up. He left his daughter $41,000 and a wristwatch, and Nora, who had been working the counter at a hotel restaurant downtown and getting home at midnight, took that money and signed a lease on an empty storefront with a broken oven and a water stain on the ceiling, shaped like the state of Florida. She called it Whitfield's. 6 tables. That was all it ever was. 6 tables, 4 of them wobbling, and a chalkboard she wrote out fresh every morning in handwriting that was too small for anyone in the back to read. She was there at 4. Not most days. Every day. She was there at 4 in the morning for 11 years, and there is a thing that people who knew her from that time all say, without prompting, without knowing that anyone else has said it. They all remember the boxes. Nora wrote the customer's name on the box. Every box. Every time. Not the order, the name. And if you came in once and gave her your name once, she had it for the rest of your life. And there is one more thing she used to do, and I need you to remember this, because I am not going to bring it up again for a very long time. If you came in near closing, and the case was nearly empty, and you looked like the day had been hard on you, Nora Whitfield would not ask you what you wanted. She would say the same 6 words she said to everyone. She would say, Sit down, I'll find you something. Sit down, I'll find you something. Hold on to that. I promise you it is going to come back. In 1999, her aunt died, her mother's younger sister, and left behind a girl. The girl's name was Vivian. She was 11 years old. There was no father in the picture. There had never been a father in the picture. And there was a state caseworker with a clipboard and a folder and a list of facilities on the far south side. Nora Whitfield was 27 years old, single, working 18-hour days, and running a business that had cleared $9,000 in profit the previous year. She took the girl anyway. There was no discussion about it. There is not a single person alive who remembers her hesitating. Vivian slept in the apartment above the bakery. When she couldn't sleep, and for the first 2 years, she could almost never sleep, she would come down the back stairs at 4 in the morning in her socks, and Nora would set her on a stool by the proof box where it was warm, and let her sit there with a cup of milk and watch. Vivi did her homework on the flower table. She learned to braid dough before she learned to braid her own hair, and the customers on that block for years thought that girl was Nora's daughter, because Nora never once corrected them. She paid for Vivian's braces. She paid for the class trip to Washington. She sat in the front row at that girl's high school graduation in 2006 and cried so hard that a stranger handed her a tissue, and when Vivian got into DePaul, Nora took out a second mortgage against a building she did not own outright to cover the first 2 years of tuition. And she never told her. Vivian Marsh went through her entire adult life believing that money had come from a scholarship. I want that fact standing in the room with us for the rest of this story. Now, Grant Callahan. He came in for the first time in the spring of 2001. He was a junior broker at a commercial firm downtown, 29 years old, in a suit that had been good 3 years earlier, and he ordered a coffee and a roll and counted out the change from his palm. He came back the next day, and the next. He came in every day for 11 days, and he ordered the cheapest thing on the board every single time, and on the 11th day he leaned on the glass case and told Nora Whitfield that she was the smartest person he had ever talked to. Now, I have thought about that sentence a great deal, because here is the thing that people who did not know Nora will never understand. It was not that she was lonely, it was not that she was naive, and it was certainly not that she was weak. It was that in 29 years nobody had ever said it to her. Not her father, who couldn't. Not her teachers, who had her marked as a nice girl who would work with her hands. Nobody. And a man walked into her shop and put that sentence down on the counter like it was nothing, like it was obvious, like he was surprised she didn't already know, and she picked it up. That is all. That is the whole trick, and it is the oldest one there is. They were married in 2002, in a small ceremony at St. Era's with 41 guests, and Vivian Marsh, 14 years old and furious about the dress, carried the flowers. In the spring of 2003, Grant found a building, a dead warehouse in a part of the West Loop that nobody wanted yet, and he had run the numbers 100 times, and he was right. He was genuinely, provably right. The problem was that he was $400,000 short, and no bank in the city was going to lend that to a 29-year-old broker with a leased car and $11,000 in savings. So Nora sold the bakery. She sold Whitfield's on Kedzie Avenue, 6 tables, 11 years, 4 o'clock every morning, and she took what was left of her father's money and the second mortgage, and she handed her husband $406,000 in the summer of 2003. She was 31 years old, and here is the detail. Here is the one I want you to hold, because everything that happens on that lake, everything that happens in that church, all of it comes out of this single moment. She did not lend it to him. She did not take a promissory note. She did not take equity. She did not take a title. She did not take a seat. She did not take one single share of the company that money built. There is no document anywhere in the state of Illinois with Nora Callahan's name on it as a founder, a partner, an investor, or a creditor. She handed a man everything she had ever built in her life, and she trusted that the word ours was going to mean something. 22 years later, when the federal attorneys went looking through the founding documents of the Callahan Group, and they went through every page, because by then, they had every reason to. Her name was not there. Not misfiled, not buried, not in a footnote. It had never been there at all. The warehouse conversion made $4 million. The next one made $9 million. By 2010, they were in Winnetka, in a house with a circular drive and rooms that Nora did not go into for weeks at a time. By 2015, Grant Callahan was on the cover of a business magazine with his hands in his pockets, standing in front of a skyline, and the word underneath the photograph was visionary. And Nora went quiet. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it is the part that people get wrong. There was no violence in that house. That is what I need you to understand. There was never a raised hand, and after the first few years, there were not even raised voices. There was no single terrible night that you could point at and say, there, that was when it turned. It was so much slower than that, and so much more polite. It started with her opinion being asked for, and then, gently, not used. Then asked for later. Then asked in front of people, as a kind of performance, and then discussed afterward in the car, as a thing she had gotten wrong. Then Grant began to answer questions that had been put to her, at dinners, warmly, with his hand on her back, before she had opened her mouth. And everyone at the table found it charming, including, for a long time, Nora. Then the accountant stopped copying her. Then the house was decorated by a woman from Lake Forest, whom Nora met twice. Then her name came off the joint account, for tax reasons, and she was given a card that drew from it, which is not the same thing at all, and she did not notice that it was not the same thing for almost 4 years. And their daughter was born in 2005, Lily. And for 18 years, Lily Callahan was the reason the whole arrangement was survivable, because a child gives a woman something to be that no one can take from her. Nora drove that girl to swim practice at 5 in the morning. Nora was in the front row of every recital, every game, every graduation. And Lily grew up watching a mother who never worked, who never argued, who never seemed to want anything, and she loved her, completely, and she also, somewhere down in a place she would not be able to look at until she was 20 years old sitting in a federal courtroom, did not entirely respect her. That is the cost. Nobody warns you about that one. In August of 2023, Lily Callahan left for college in Ann Arbor, and Nora Callahan came home to a house with 11 rooms in it and stood in the front hall for a very long time. She was 51. No, I want to be accurate, because she was younger than people assume when they hear this story. She was 45 years old that August. She had not been asked a question she was qualified to answer in 9 years. She had no bank account of her own. She had no business, no colleagues, no title, and no name that meant anything to anyone she had not personally fed. And in the fall of that year, without telling her husband, Nora Callahan began to bake again. She got up at 4. She had not gotten up at 4 in 20 years, and her body remembered it instantly, the way you remember a language you spoke as a child. She would go down to that enormous kitchen in the dark, and she would work, laminating dough, proofing, shaping, scoring, and by 7 in the morning, there would be bread cooling on every surface in that room, more than any 2 people could eat in a week. And then Grant would come downstairs at 7:30, and he would kiss the top of her head, and he would say something kind, and he would leave. And Nora would throw all of it away, every morning, into a black bag, still warm, and out to the bin at the end of the drive before the housekeeper came. She did this 4 days a week for almost a year, and nobody in that house ever knew, and I want you to sit with the picture of it for a second, because that is the whole marriage in one image. A woman standing in the best kitchen in Winnetka at 7 in the morning, throwing away the only thing she had ever been good at, because there was nobody left in that house who was hungry. Somewhere in those 22 years, without one argument, without one slammed door, without a single thing that a court or a friend or a priest would ever have recognized as harm, Nora Callahan had been erased. And the most dangerous thing about being erased is that it does not hurt. It does not feel like anything at all. You simply look up one day and understand that the room keeps going when you leave it. And then, in March of 2024, 7 months before the lake, she opened a folder on her husband's desk. She was not looking for anything. That is the part she would repeat, later, to Ruth Vega, in an interview room, 3 separate times, as if she still needed someone to believe her. She was looking for the property tax statement, and underneath it there was a personal guarantee, a $12 million personal guarantee on a construction loan out of a bank in Indiana. And at the bottom of the last page, on the line marked guarantor, in blue ink, was her own name. Nora Callahan looked at her signature for a long time. She had never signed it. She asked him about it that night. Now, I want to tell you what you are expecting to hear, because you are expecting a scene. You are expecting a confrontation in a kitchen, raised voices, a glass on the floor, a man who turns and shows you what he really is. That is not what happened, and the fact that it is not what happened is the reason Nora Callahan spent the next 7 months doing nothing at all. She waited until after dinner. She had rehearsed it. She told Vega this, later, and she was embarrassed about it, that she had rehearsed how to ask her own husband a question in her own home. She put the folder on the table. She said, "Grant, this isn't my signature." And he looked at it, and his face did something extraordinary. It fell. He put his hand over his mouth, and he sat down slowly, and he said, "Oh God, oh Nora." And then he told her a story that was so reasonable, and so detailed, and so full of small, self-incriminating admissions that no liar would ever volunteer, that within 4 minutes, she was the one apologizing. The closing had been at 7 in the morning. She had been asleep. It was a formality. The bank required a spousal guarantee on any loan over $10 million. It was boilerplate. Every developer in the city did it, and he had been so far underwater on time that he had told his assistant to just sign it, and he would fix it Monday, and Monday had become a week, and a week had become a year, and he was ashamed of it, and he should have told her, and he hated himself for it, and he would call the lawyer in the morning and have it corrected properly with her actual signature so that it was clean. And then he said the thing that finished it. He said, "I have been treating you like furniture in your own house, and I did not even notice I was doing it." She cried. He held her. He called the lawyer the next morning in front of her, on speaker, and Nora heard a man say, "Yes, we'll get that re-executed, no problem at all." And the folder went back in the drawer, and Nora Callahan went upstairs feeling closer to her husband than she had felt in 9 years. The document was never corrected. Not that week. Not that year. Not ever. And I need you to not judge her for letting it go. I need that from you, actually, because there is a version of this story where you spend the next hour thinking she was a fool, and if you think that, you will miss the entire point of what I am about to show you. For 22 years, that man's voice was the voice she used to determine what was true. That is not a weakness in her character. That is what 22 years does. You do not audit the person you have built your reality out of. Nobody does. You would not have either. But something had changed anyway. Because from that night in March, Nora Callahan started noticing things. In April, she drove downtown to bring Grant the passport he had forgotten, and rather than call up, she took the elevator down to the parking level where he kept his car. And she came out of the elevator and stopped, because her husband was standing between 2 concrete pillars with 3 men. 2 of them were young, in good coats, standing slightly apart, and doing nothing at all. The third was older, silver at the temples, maybe 50, in a gray overcoat, and he had his hands folded in front of him, and he was not speaking. That is the detail she came back to, over and over, for the rest of her life. He was not shouting, he was not gesturing, he was simply standing there, completely still, while Grant Callahan, a man who had been on the cover of a magazine, a man who owned the building above their heads, talked at him with his palms out, sweating through the back of his shirt in a 50-degree garage. Grant looked up and saw her, and the older man in the gray coat turned his head, slowly, and looked at her too. And that was all. Nobody said anything. Nora went back up in the elevator and left the passport with the receptionist and drove home. And when Grant came in that night at 11, he did not mention it, and neither did she. And then, in the doorway of the bedroom, without turning the light on, he said one sentence. He said, "Nora, stop asking questions." In 22 years, he had never spoken to her like that. Not once. She did not know that man's name. She would not learn it for another 6 months. She would learn it in a bed in a house in Albany Park, with a fractured wrist and a blanket she did not recognize, when he was the only person on earth who knew that she was alive. Now I have to explain what Grant Callahan had actually done, and I am going to do it plainly, because it is not complicated once somebody says it out loud. It only sounds complicated because men like Grant have spent their whole lives depending on the fact that it sounds complicated. The tower on the near north side was a disaster. It had opened in 2022 into a market that no longer existed, and by the spring of 2024, it was 41% leased. That building cost $900,000 a month to carry, and it was bringing in less than half of that. The Callahan Group had 11 other properties, and 6 of them were cross-collateralized against the tower, which means, in plain English, that if the tower went, they all went with it, like a man falling off a roof holding 6 other people by the wrist. So he did what men in that position do. He borrowed, first from banks, then, when the banks stopped, from funds, and then, when the funds stopped, in the fall of 2023, Grant Callahan borrowed $9 million from people who do not have a compliance department. They were introduced to him at a restaurant by a man he trusted. The money moved through a linen supply company and 2 construction subcontractors, and it landed in the Callahan Group as a receivable for work that had never been performed. And it kept the lights on. It kept the tower breathing for another 11 months, and it bought him time. And in the summer of 2024, Grant Callahan made a decision that would eventually put him in a federal prison for 34 years. He started running that same money out through a rival organization's paper, because their rate was better and because he had told himself he would put it all back before anybody noticed. Seo Jin Beck noticed in 9 days. But this is the part I need you to actually hear, because this is not a story about a man's finances. Look at where the exposure sits. The $9 million came in through a shell. That shell was a subsidiary of the entity that held the tower, and the tower's debt was guaranteed, personally, unconditionally, in blue ink, by Nora Callahan. He had not simply used her money in 2003. Over 22 years, patiently, mostly without malice, in the same way he had taken her opinions and her bank account and her name. Grant Callahan had built a machine in which every single dollar of criminal and civil liability landed on his wife, and none of it landed on him. If it held together, he was a visionary. If it came apart, a federal prosecutor was going to look at that structure and see one signature at the bottom of all of it, and it was going to be hers. And she had signed every page of it in her sleep. Then, in September, something happened that nobody has ever fully explained, and I have my own opinion about it, and I will give it to you at the end. Grant Callahan started being kind again. It came on all at once. He was home for dinner. He asked her about her day, and then he waited for the answer, and he did not look at his phone while she gave it. He took her to a restaurant on a Tuesday for no reason. He told her, twice, that he knew he had lost the plot, that the company had eaten 10 years of their life, and that when the tower stabilized, he wanted them to go somewhere for a month, just the two of them. He touched her hair in the kitchen. And Nora Callahan, and this is the sentence in this whole story that I find hardest to say out loud. Nora Callahan was happy. In September of 2024, 6 weeks before the last night of her life as she understood it, she called an old friend from the bakery days, a woman she had not spoken to in 3 years, and she said, "I think we're going to be all right." On the 3rd of October, Grant told her he had booked the lake house. They had a place on the Michigan side, up past the state line, that they had not used in 4 years. He said he wanted a weekend with no phones. He booked it for the 12th. He paid a deposit on a card, and he told his assistant to clear his Monday, and he asked Nora, in front of the housekeeper, whether she wanted to drive up Friday or Saturday. She packed on the morning of the 12th. Her friend, the one from the bakery, remembers the phone call, and she said Nora sounded like she was 26 years old. And 11 days before that weekend, on the 1st of October, Grant Callahan had called his insurance broker with a question. He wanted to know whether a policy that had been taken out in 2019, a term life policy on his wife, $800,000, with their daughter Lily named as the sole beneficiary, whether that policy would still pay out in a case where a body was never recovered. The broker told him it would. It would just take longer. They left Winnetka at just after 6 in the evening on Saturday the 12th of October. The rain started around Michigan City. By the time they crossed into Michigan, it had turned to something halfway between rain and ice, the kind that does not fall so much as arrive, and the wipers could not keep the windshield clear at any speed. Grant drove. He always drove. He had one hand on the wheel, and he was talking, and he was so alive that night. She told Vega this, and Vega wrote it down and underlined it. He was funnier than he had been in a decade. He made an impression of his own CFO. He talked about Lily, about how she was going to be better at all of this than either of them. He reached over at one point, in the dark, and put his hand flat on Nora's knee and left it there. The lake road out to the house runs along a causeway for about 1.5 miles. Water on both sides, a low guardrail on one, no guardrail at all on the other, and no lights. There has been a proposal to put lights on that stretch every year since 1996. At around 11:50 at night, Grant Callahan slowed the car and said that he had heard something. There was a sound, he said, from the rear passenger side, like something was dragging. He pulled the car onto the shoulder, and he put it in park, and he left the engine running and the headlights on, and he got out into the sleet, and Nora watched him in the side mirror walk back along the length of the car with his shoulders up around his ears. Then he walked past the rear of the car, and she lost him in the mirror, and there was a long moment where nothing happened at all. Nora Callahan sat in the passenger seat of a car on a causeway in the dark, with the heater running and the wipers going, and she waited for her husband to come back and tell her it was nothing. She heard the driver's door open. She turned toward it, and she said his name. Nobody got in. The car began to move. "It is 19 feet from the shoulder of that road to the edge," she told them, afterward, that she did not understand what was happening. Not for the first second, not even for the second second. Her brain offered her every explanation it had. The car was in gear. He had bumped the shifter, the ice. She reached over for the wheel with her left hand, and her seatbelt locked across her chest and held her back, and the front tires went over the edge, and the car came nose first into 49-degree water, and it did not float. Nobody ever tells you that. A car does not float. It goes down at an angle with the engine leading, and the water comes up over the windshield in under 9 seconds. The water came in through the doors first, around her feet, so cold it did not feel like cold. It felt like a hand closing, and she could not get the belt off. She hit the button. She hit it, and it did not release. And there is a mechanical reason for that. Under load, under the weight of a body pressed forward against it at an angle, those buckles will jam, and every one of us assumes we will be able to press a button, and 1,100 people a year in this country cannot. She could not press the button. The water came up over her lap and her chest, and she got her chin up into the last 4 inches of air at the roof of that car, and she pressed her mouth into it, and she took one breath, and it was black, and it was silent, and she went under. Her last thought was not about Grant. She has said this many times, and I believe her. Her last thought, in 8 feet of water in Lake Michigan on the 12th of October, was that the bread on the counter at home was going to go bad, and nobody was going to eat it. The next thing that Nora Callahan heard was a car door. Not hers. Hers was under the water, 21 feet out from the edge of the causeway, and the interior of it was full, and there was nobody in it. Her seatbelt had come loose 40 seconds after she stopped fighting it, which is also a thing they do not tell you. She had come up under the surface without knowing it and been carried into the rocks at the base of the shoulder, and she was lying on her side on those rocks in the sleet, at the edge of the road, with a fractured wrist and a body temperature that was already falling out of the range where a hospital would have expected her to survive the drive. And a car door closed. Somewhere above her, up on the road. Her husband called 911 at 12:41 in the morning. That is not disputed. It is on the recording, and it is time-stamped, and the recording has been played in a federal courtroom. He tells the dispatcher that his car has gone into the water. He tells them that his wife is in it. He is breathing hard, and he is crying, and it is, I will say this plainly, an extraordinary performance. The car entered the water at approximately 11:58, 43 minutes. He told them he had run for a signal. He said he had run 1.5 miles back toward the highway with his phone up over his head. And when the first deputy reached him at 1:09 in the morning, that deputy wrote a single observation in his notes, and then went home and thought about it for 14 months and did nothing. He wrote that Grant Callahan was dry. They dove for 9 days. They found the car on the second morning. They found her purse in the footwell and her overnight bag in the trunk, folded, with a book in it. On the 4th day, 1.5 miles north along the shore, they found one shoe. They did not find Nora Callahan because Nora Callahan was 41 miles away, in a bedroom on the 2nd floor of a house in Albany Park, under 3 blankets, on the 4th day of a fever that had gone to 104, with a man she had never met sitting in a chair by the door. The funeral was on the 30th of October at St. Ita's, the same church where she had been married in 2002. There were 240 people there. Grant Callahan spoke for 11 minutes, and he broke down at the end, and 2 men had to help him down from the lectern. Vivian Marsh sat in the 2nd row, next to Lily, and held that girl's hand through the entire service. She had filed the marriage license application 9 days earlier. She woke up on the 4th day. The room she woke up in was on the 2nd floor of a brick 2-flat on a street in Albany Park, on the northwest side of Chicago, about 6 miles from the storefront on Kedzie Avenue, where she had once written strangers' names on boxes. She did not know that. She did not know anything. There was a window with the blind drawn, and a dresser with nothing on it, and a chair by the door with a man sitting in it. And her right wrist was splinted, and her chest hurt when she breathed. And the first thing she said, in a voice that had been scraped raw by a tube she had no memory of, was, "Is my daughter all right? Not where I am, not who you are. Is my daughter all right?" The man in the chair said yes, and then he told her the rest of it, in order, without stopping, and without softening a single part of it, which is the only mercy he had to offer, and he knew it. He told her that her car had gone into the lake on the 12th. He told her that it was now the 16th. He told her that the search had been running for 4 days and that her husband had reported her missing at 12:41 in the morning, 43 minutes after the car went in, and that he had been on television twice. He told her that she was, as of that moment, in the eyes of every police department in 2 states, a body that had not been found yet. And then he told her that her husband had not been trying to get a signal. He had been standing on the shoulder of the road, in the sleet, watching the water, for 6 or 7 minutes, and that this was not a theory, and it was not a guess, because he had been there. His name was Kedzie Beck. He was 54 years old. He had come to this country at 19, with a brother and no English, and by the time he was 30, he had built something that the city of Chicago has never officially acknowledged exists. He owned 3 hotels. He owned a linen service that washed sheets for 40 more. He owned the quiet half of a construction site and 2 restaurants on Lawrence Avenue that made money, which almost no restaurant does. He had never been convicted of a crime. He had never, as far as anyone can determine, been photographed. And he had 2 rules, and every man who worked for him could recite them. He did not touch women, and he did not forget a debt. $9 million of his money had gone into the Callahan Group in the fall of 2023, and in August of 2024, Kedzie Beck learned that Grant Callahan had begun cycling that same money through paper belonging to an organization that was not his. That is not a financial problem. In the world that man lived in, that is a message. And so he had done what he always did, which was nothing at all, visibly, for 6 weeks, while 2 of his men sat in Grant Callahan's car. They were 400 yards back on that causeway on the night of the 12th. They had followed him out of Winnetka. They watched the headlights stop. They watched a man get out of the car and walk to the driver's side and lean in, and then step back and stand there, in the rain, with his hands at his sides, while his own car rolled forward and went over the edge. And here is where I have to be honest with you about who Kedzie Beck was, because if I let you fall in love with him now, you will not understand the ending. He did not go down to that water because he was a good man. He went down because Nora Callahan was worth $9 million to him alive, and nothing at all to him dead. Understand the structure. The tower's debt sat behind a personal guarantee. That guarantee was signed, forged but signed, and unchallenged for 5 years, which in a courtroom is nearly the same thing, by Nora Callahan. If Nora Callahan died in that lake, Grant inherited the estate. The guarantee died with the guarantor. The tower went into a receivership that Beck could not touch without exposing himself, and $9 million of his money evaporated into a probate court in Cook County. But if she lived, if there was a living woman with a valid claim, a living signature, a living witness, then Kedzie Beck did not have a debtor anymore. He had a key. He carried her 41 miles in the back of a car with a doctor who did not ask questions and has never spoken to anyone about it. He put her in bed, and when she woke up on the 4th day, he sat in that chair and he told her the truth, all of it, including that part. He did not tell her he had saved her. He told her what she was. He said, "Your husband tried to kill you." He said, "You are legally dead, and in about 9 more days they will stop looking, and after that, you will simply be a name on a stone." He said, "You have no money, no passport, no bank account, and no name." He said, "If you walk out of this house and go to the police, you will be a hysterical woman with no body and no evidence accusing a grieving millionaire, and you will be back in that water by Friday, and this time nobody will be 400 yards behind you." And then he said, "Or you stay, and you learn, and in 1 year I will hand you back your own life." And then he said the sentence that she thought about every single day for the next 14 months. He said, "Until then, you are mine. Not as a woman, understand me, as an asset." Do you know the difference? And Nora Callahan lay in that bed, in a house she did not know, in a body that did not work, with a wrist that was broken and a marriage that was over and a daughter 2 states away who was at that moment picking out a dress for her mother's funeral, and she said yes. And then she asked him a question. She looked at this man who had just explained to her in careful, quiet English that she was a piece of collateral in a $9 million dispute. And she looked at the chair he had been sitting in for 4 days and the food on the tray by the door that had not been touched, and she said, "Have you eaten?" Seo Jin Baek did not answer her. He stood up. He walked out of that room, and he closed the door behind him, and he stood in the hallway of his own house for a very long time, long enough that one of his men came up the stairs and saw him standing there and turned around and went back down. And I am going to tell you why. I promise you that I am going to tell you exactly why, but not for another hour, and when I do, you are going to want to go back and watch this part again. She was in that house for 426 days. The first 6 weeks, she was simply ill. The lake had put fluid in her lungs, and it took a long time to leave. She did not speak much. She slept 14 hours a day, and when she was awake, she sat by that window, with the blind cracked 2 inches, and watched a street she did not know. And on the 30th of October, at 11 in the morning, she sat in that chair and did not move for 4 hours, because she knew where everybody was. Then, in the middle of December, Nora Callahan came downstairs. Baek had a room on the first floor at the back of that house, with a long table in it, and on that table, every day, were documents. Not his. He was too careful for that. They were structures, deal papers, entity charts, guarantees, subordination agreements, the whole ugly architecture of how money is moved and hidden and made to belong to somebody who did not earn it. And she stood in the doorway one afternoon and asked him what a subsidiary was. He told her. She asked another question. He answered that one too, and then he stopped what he was doing and he pulled out a chair. Here is what nobody expected, including her, and including him. Nora Callahan was extraordinary at it. She was better at it in 6 weeks than men who had been doing it for 20 years. And the reason is not a mystery, and it is not a talent, and it is not a movie. The reason is that she had spent 22 years sitting at dinner tables listening to Grant Callahan explain deals to other men. She had heard every excuse, every structure, every dodge, in her own kitchen, in her own car, at 2 in the morning when he came home, wound up and needed an audience. She had been treated as furniture in a room where crimes were described out loud for 2 decades. Furniture hears everything, and she had one more advantage. She had been a woman who ran a business with 6 tables and a $9,000 margin, where every single dollar had to be accounted for by hand at the end of the night, or she did not eat. Grant Callahan had never in his life balanced anything. He had only ever moved things. By February, she was reading his loan documents. By March, she was reading his loan documents faster than Beck's lawyers. And in April, in the 4th month, on an ordinary afternoon, at a table in a back room in Albany Park, Nora Callahan found something. It was in the 2019 restructuring. It was the same document package that carried the forged guarantee, the one she had found in the folder on his desk. It was on page 91 of 140. It was 4 sentences long, and it was a clause that Grant Callahan had written himself, with his own lawyer, for his own protection, in a year when he was afraid of his creditors and not yet afraid of anything else. She read it 3 times. Then she put the page down, and she sat there, and she looked at the wall for a while, and Seo Jin Baek, who had been watching her from the other end of that table for 4 months, watched her face change and set down what he was holding and said, "And Nora Callahan, a woman who for 4 months had answered every single question put to her in that house, with another question, who had not asked for one thing, not a coat, not a phone call, not a photograph of her own daughter, looked up and said, "I don't want the money, I want the wedding." Ruth Vega was 58 years old, and 6 months from a pension she had been counting in days since 2019. She had been a police officer for 31 years. 22 of those were violent crimes. She was not a brilliant detective. She would have told you that herself, and she did tell people that, often, because she had learned early that in a room full of men, it was safer to be underestimated than to be right. What Ruth Vega was stubborn. And what bothered Ruth Vega about the Callahan drowning, from the first week, was not a theory, and it was not a hunch. It was two facts that would not sit down next to each other. The first fact was 43 minutes. The second fact was that the man was dry. She read the responding deputy's notes in November. One line, at the bottom of the page, almost apologetic, subject's clothing and hair observed dry on contact. Vega sat in a parking lot with that piece of paper on her steering wheel and thought about a man who claimed to have run 1.5 miles through freezing rain, in October, in Michigan, at midnight, with his phone above his head. She drove out to that causeway in December. She stood on the shoulder in her coat. She paced it, she timed it, and at the end of the afternoon she understood something that never made it into any report, because there was nowhere to put it. Even if he had run, even if he had sprinted, in a suit, on ice, for 1.5 miles, he had not gone into the water, not once, not to the door, not to the window, not to the roof of a car that was in 8 feet of water 21 feet from the shoulder, with his wife of 22 years inside it. He had stood on the shoulder in the dark and he had watched. She took it to the state's attorney's office in January. They were kind about it. That is what she remembers. They were extremely kind. A man 11 years younger than her explained, gently, that she had no body, no forensics, no witness, and no motive, because they had already checked the insurance, and the $800,000 went to the daughter, not the husband, and that what she did have was a grieving widower who had appeared on the news in tears, and a jury in Cook County who would hate her, personally, for putting him through it. They told her to let it go. She did not let it go. She let it go the way experienced police let things go, which is that she stopped putting it on paper and kept doing it anyway. And in the spring, she found the affair. This is the part where, if you have watched enough of these, you can feel the story clicking into a shape you recognize. Because a detective looking at a suspicious drowning found a second phone, 11 hotel charges in 3 cities, and a woman. And the woman was not a stranger. The woman was the victim's own cousin, a 33-year-old executive assistant at the victim's husband's company, a girl the victim had raised. Vega built it out on a whiteboard in a room she had signed out under a different case number, and she stood back and looked at it, and it was beautiful. It was clean. Motive, means, opportunity, and a woman in a hotel in Cleveland. She took it back to the state's attorney in April, and they killed it again. And I want you to understand why, because it is going to matter in about 20 minutes. They killed it because an affair is not a murder. Because half the men in that county have been in a hotel in Cleveland. Because with no body, no evidence, and no confession, all she had was a man who cheated on his wife and then his wife drowned. And there is not a defense attorney in the state who could not take that apart in one afternoon. Ruth Vega went home that night and told her sister she was done. And then, in June, for reasons she has never been able to explain except that she was in the building anyway, Ruth Vega walked into the Cook County clerk's office and pulled the marriage license. Grant Callahan and Vivian Marsh had a wedding date on file for October the 14th. That she knew. The whole city knew. It was in a magazine, a 2-page spread about a widower finding love again, and there is a photograph in it of Vivian Marsh in a white coat, laughing, with her hand on his chest. What Vega had never checked was when the application was filed, because a marriage license application is not the wedding. It is the paperwork. It is a piece of state paper that somebody physically walks into a county office and fills out at a counter, and it gets a date stamp, and that date stamp goes into a file that nobody ever looks at. The date stamp said October the 23rd. Nora Callahan's car went into Lake Michigan on the 12th. 11 days. Ruth Vega stood at that counter and did the arithmetic 4 times because she did not believe it. On the 23rd of October, the search was still active. There were divers in that water on the 23rd of October. There was a boat, and 4 men, and a grid, and a mother, 2 states away being told to prepare herself. The funeral was still a week away. The headstone had not been cut, and on that day, at a counter in the Cook County Clerk's office at 118 North Clark Street, somebody had stood in line, filled out a form, paid $60, and applied for permission to marry the dead woman's husband. And Vega looked at the bottom of the form, at the box marked applicant, at the handwriting. It was not Grant Callahan's. Ruth Vega went out to her car in the parking garage and sat in it for a very long time without starting the engine, because she had spent 8 months looking at a man. 8 months. Every hour of unpaid time she had, every favor she had left, every night she had lied to her sister about where she was. All of it aimed at Grant Callahan, the developer, the widower, the man on the cover of the magazine. She had been chasing the husband. She should have been chasing the bride. October the 14th was a Saturday, and it came in cold and very bright, the way the best days in that city always do in the middle of October, when the light comes in low and turns every window on Michigan Avenue gold for about an hour in the morning. Vivian Marsh got ready in a suite on the 11th floor of a hotel 4 blocks from the church. She had chosen that hotel herself. She had walked through 3 others and rejected them, and she had told her bridesmaids that this one had better light. And I want to tell you something about that hotel, and I am going to say it once and then leave it alone, because it is the kind of detail that will sit in your stomach for the rest of this story. Seo Jin-baek had owned that building since 2011. She did not know that. Nobody at that wedding knew that. There is no filing anywhere in the state of Illinois that connects his name to that property. It sits under a management company that sits under a holding company that sits under a trust in Delaware, and Vivian Marsh chose it because of the light. There is a photograph from that morning. It has been printed in newspapers. It is a good photograph. Vivienne, in white, on the edge of the bed, laughing with her head back, holding her bouquet up over her face, while somebody says something out of frame. And behind her, in the mirrored closet door, out of focus, there is a woman in a gray uniform in the doorway carrying towels. Nobody looked at the towels. The ceremony was at 11 o'clock at St. Ida's, on the north side, which is the church where Grant Callahan had married Nora Whitfield in the summer of 2002. And it is the church where he had stood at the lectern 11 months earlier and cried so hard that 2 men had to help him down. He chose it. That is a fact, and it is in the trial record. And his own defense attorney was never able to explain it. Vivian wanted a hotel ballroom. Grant Callahan insisted on St. Ida's. Now, I have my own opinion about why a man does that, and I will give it to you later, but for now I will only say this. There is a kind of man who cannot enjoy a thing unless he has taken it from someone. 206 people came. Lily Callahan sat in the second row. She was 20 years old, and she was in a navy dress, and she had flown in from Ann Arbor on Thursday. She had not wanted to come. She had told her roommate that she was going to be sick. And she came, and she sat in the second row, and she held her program with both hands, and she did not once look at the aisle when the bride came down it. And at 4 minutes past 11 at the back of that church, in the shadow of the last pew, in a gray coat, with her hair cut short and dyed a color she hated, A 47-year-old woman stood with her hands folded in front of her and watched. She had rehearsed this. Beck had walked her through it 11 separate times in the back room of that house in Albany Park. Where to stand, when to arrive, when to leave, what to do with her hands, what to do if someone spoke to her. He had been ruthless about it. He had told her, more than once, that if she broke, everything they had built in 14 months would go to nothing, and she would go back into the water. And she was fine. She was completely fine. She was fine when the doors opened, and she was fine when the organ started, and she was fine when Vivian Marsh walked past her, close enough that Nora Callahan could smell her perfume, which was the perfume Nora had bought her for her 30th birthday. And then she looked at the second row. And what nobody had prepared her for, what Seojin Beck in 14 months of planning had never once thought to prepare her for, was the back of her daughter's head. She had not seen her child in 426 days. She had not heard her voice. She had a photograph, printed on paper, that Beck had allowed her in March. And there she was, 11 rows away, alive, in a navy dress, with her hair pinned up the way Nora had taught her to do it when she was 15 years old, and going to a dance. Nora Callahan reached out and put one hand on the back of the pew in front of her. That is all. That is the whole thing. That is the only moment in this entire story where she came apart, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and the only person on earth who saw it was a man in a dark coat standing 8 feet behind her, who did not move and did not speak, and who later told a federal prosecutor, under a proffer agreement, that it was the single worst thing he ever watched a person survive. Then she took her hand off the pew, and the priest said the words, and Grant Callahan turned to Vivian Marsh and promised, in the same building, in the same spot, in the same voice, to love her and to keep her until death parted them. And Nora Callahan turned around and walked out. She left before the kiss, and I want to be very precise with you about why. Because this is the exact moment where every assumption you have been carrying for the last hour and a quarter begins to come apart in your hands. She did not leave because she could not bear it. She left because she had somewhere to be at 11:20, and she was not going to be late. At 11:20 in the morning, while 200 people were still standing on the steps of St. Ida's throwing rice, an email left a server in Seoul and arrived simultaneously at 14 addresses. The Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, 2 federal judges, 3 newspapers, a partner at the accounting firm that audited the Callahan Group, the general counsel of the bank in Indiana that held the $12 million note, and, at the very bottom of the list, an address belonging to a 61-year-old woman in Naperville, Illinois, who was Vivian Marsh's mother's sister, the only blood relative Vivian had left. The attachment was 410 pages. Now I have to explain what Nora Callahan found on page 91, and I am going to explain it slowly because it is the whole story, and because when you understand it, you are going to feel the floor move. In 2019, Grant Callahan restructured his company. He was frightened that year. The tower was still a hole in the ground. He was leveraged past anything a bank would recognize as sane, and he had a lawyer who told him, correctly, that if the company ever failed, his creditors would come for his house, his cars, and everything he had. So Grant did what men like Grant do. He built a wall between himself and his own company. He moved the beneficial ownership of the operating entity into a structure held by a trust, and he wrote, with his own attorney, in his own document, a succession clause. 4 sentences, page 91. The clause said that in the event of the principal's death, incapacity, or legal disqualification, all beneficial ownership of the entity, together with all associated obligations, liabilities, guarantees, and encumbrances would pass in their entirety to the principal's lawful spouse. He wrote that to protect himself. Think about what that sentence actually is. He built a company on his wife's money. He forged his wife's name onto a $12 million guarantee. And then he wrote a clause that said, if this ever comes apart, my wife owns all of it. The assets, yes, but also every debt, every guarantee, every dollar of exposure. He was not being generous. He was building a shield, and the shield was a person. If the federal government ever came through that door, they were going to find one name at the bottom of every fraudulent page in the building, and it was going to be hers, and she was going to be standing in front of him. Nora Callahan was never his wife in the way he described it to people at dinner parties. She was the fire door. And here is what she understood on that afternoon in April, at a table in Albany Park, with her wrist finally healed and 410 pages in front of her. She was legally dead. The state of Michigan had issued a presumption of death. The state of Illinois had recorded it. An insurance company had paid out on it. In the eyes of every court in this country, Nora Callahan did not exist, and had not existed since the 12th of October. And a dead woman cannot be a spouse, and a dead woman cannot hold beneficial ownership, and a dead woman cannot be prosecuted, which meant that on the day her husband died, or was incapacitated, or was legally disqualified, that clause was going to reach out and find whoever was standing in her place. She did not need to prove that Grant Callahan tried to murder her. She had no evidence of that. There was no camera on that causeway, and Seojin Beck's men were never, under any circumstance, going to walk into a police station and say what they saw. She needed one thing. She needed Grant Callahan to have a wife again. That is why she went to the church. Not to grieve, not to look at him, not for closure, or revenge, or the drama of the thing. Nora Callahan stood in the shadow of the last pew at St. Ida's on the 14th of October for one single reason, and it was to be a witness, to see, with her own eyes, that the ceremony was completed, that the vows were exchanged, that the certificate was signed, and that the marriage between Grant Callahan and Vivian Marsh was legally, unambiguously, irreversibly binding. Because she had a 410-page federal referral sitting on a server in Seoul with a timer on it, and it was set for 11:20. At the moment Vivian Marsh signed her name on that certificate in the sacristy of St. Ida's, and there is a photograph of her doing it, laughing, with the pen in her left hand. Vivian Marsh became, under a clause her new husband had written himself, the lawful spouse of a man who was about to be legally disqualified by a federal indictment. She became the beneficial owner of $94 million in real estate. She also became the guarantor of a $12 million forged note, the counterparty of record on $9 million in laundered funds, the signatory on a wire fraud structure that ran through 4 states, and the single named individual standing at the bottom of every single page of the worst financial crime committed in the city of Chicago that decade. He built the fire door out of his wife, and then he married a new one. Now, I have been careful with you about Vivian Marsh for an hour and a half, and it is time to stop being careful. Because the version you have been carrying, and I know you have, because it is the version I carried when I first went looking at this, is that Vivian was young and stupid and flattered, and that a powerful man in his 50s reached down into his own family and took a girl who did not know how to say no to him. That is the story we tell. It is comfortable. It lets us keep our sympathies where they were. It is not true. The affair did not begin in the tower, and it did not begin with Grant. It began 11 weeks after Nora Callahan got her cousin that job. And it began, according to 2 separate depositions and a 4-year phone record, with Vivian. It was Vivian who found the life insurance policy. She was the executive assistant. She processed the benefits paperwork, and there is an email from 2021 in which she asks the broker, in writing, whether a term policy pays out in a case where a body is not recovered. 3 years before Grant Callahan ever asked that same question, his mistress had already asked it. And on the night of the 11th of October, at 9:40 in the evening, while Nora Callahan was upstairs in Winnetka, packing a bag for a weekend at the lake, and calling a friend from the bakery days to say that she thought everything was going to be all right, Vivian Marsh sent a text message to Grant Callahan. It was 8 words long. She still thinks she's going for the weekend. Nora Callahan raised that girl. She took her in when the state was standing in a hallway with a clipboard. She put her on a stool by a warm oven at 4 in the morning when she was 11 years old and could not sleep because her mother was dead. She paid for her braces and her class trip and her college, and she never told her about the last one. And she sat in the front row at her graduation and cried like an idiot, and a stranger handed her a tissue. And I have thought about this more than any other part of this story, and I do not have a clean answer for you, and I am not going to pretend to. But I will tell you what I have come to. Vivian Marsh did not do it for the money. She did it because she had spent 23 years being rescued by Nora Callahan. 23 years of being the one who was taken in. 23 years of a debt that could never be paid, that was never once mentioned, that was never held over her. And that is the part that people who have never been on the receiving end of enormous kindness will not understand. There is a kind of person for whom gratitude curdles, for whom being saved does not feel like love. It feels like being owned, and the only way out from under it is to take everything the other person has. They arrested Grant Callahan at his own wedding reception. It was 1:40 in the afternoon. The federal warrant had been signed at 12:50 on an emergency basis by a judge in the Dirksen building who had spent his lunch hour reading a 410-page attachment and had come back to his chambers and said, out loud, to no one, "My God." They took him out through the ballroom. He was still in the tuxedo. There is footage of it. A guest filmed it on a phone, and it has been viewed a number of times that I am not going to say out loud. And what people always talk about is the cake, which was still on the table, uncut, 3 tiers, with 2 figures on the top of it. But that is not what I look at when I watch it. What I look at is that as they walked him past the second row of tables, Grant Callahan turned his head and looked for Vivian. And Vivian Marsh, in her wedding dress, took 1 step backward away from him. 1 step. In under a second, before he had said a word, she had already started calculating. They arrested her 6 days later, at Terminal 5 at O'Hare, on the jet bridge, holding a boarding pass for Lisbon and a carry-on bag containing $41,000 in cash and a passport in a name that was not hers. The trial took 9 weeks. The defense was the only defense available, and it was, I have to admit, the most spectacular thing I have ever read in a transcript. Grant Callahan took the stand, against the advice of his own attorney, who told the judge so on the record, and he told a courtroom, under oath, that his wife was alive. He said she had done all of this. He said she had faked her death, that she had conspired with organized crime, that she had built this entire structure to destroy him, and that she was, at that very moment, somewhere in the city of Chicago, laughing at him. Every word of that was true. And the prosecutor stood up and let it sit for a moment, and then said the sentence that ended Grant Callahan's life. She said, "Mr. Callahan, your wife is dead. You told us so yourself. Under oath, twice, in 2 separate insurance proceedings, from which your daughter received $800,000. Would you like to change that testimony now?" He could not, because the instant he proved Nora Callahan was alive, the presumption of death collapsed. The insurance payout became fraud, and his daughter, the only person on earth he had never once lied about loving, became a party to it. He sat there for 11 seconds. It is in the transcript, marked as a pause. And then he said no. The jury was out for 6 hours. Grant Callahan was convicted of attempted murder, wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy, and sentenced to 34 years. Vivian Marsh was convicted of conspiracy and fraud and sentenced to 19. Neither one of them will see the outside of a federal facility before they are past 60. And on the 11th day of that trial, in a hallway on the 23rd floor of the Dirksen Federal Building, a woman from the United States Attorney's Office took a 21-year-old college student into an empty conference room, sat her down, and told her that her mother was alive. I am not going to describe that. It is not mine to describe, and it is not yours to watch. I will only tell you that a federal marshal who was standing outside that door has been on the job for 19 years, and he stepped away down the corridor, and he has never talked about it since. Now, Sojin Beck, we have one question left, and I told you at the beginning of this that it was the one that was going to stay with you, and I have made you wait an hour and a half for it. Why did he do it? Not the collateral. He told her the collateral story on the 4th day, in a bedroom in Albany Park, and it was true. Every word of it was true. The 9 million, the guarantee, the key. Sojin Beck never once lied to Nora Callahan. She has said that in interviews, and it is the only thing she has ever said about him that sounds like a defense. But that was not the reason. Here is the reason. In the fall of 2004, on a night in November, at about 7:45 in the evening, a 19-year-old boy came into a bakery on Kedzie Avenue about 10 minutes before it closed. He was bleeding through the front of his coat, and he was holding his arm against his body, and he had not eaten in 2 days, and he had nowhere in the city of Chicago that he could go. There was a woman behind the counter. She was 32 years old, and the case was nearly empty, and it was the end of a very long day. She did not call the police, she did not ask him what had happened, and she did not ask him his name, and she did not ask him to leave. She locked the door. She turned the sign around, and she said 6 words to him. She said, "Sit down, I'll find you something." She fed him. She cleaned his arm at the sink in the back with a towel and a bottle of something out of a first aid kit under the register. She let him sleep on a folding cot in the back room, the cot that a little girl named Vivian used to sit near, in her socks, at 4 in the morning, watching the ovens. And in the morning she gave him a bag of food, and she let him out the back door, and she never told a single living soul that it had happened. Not her husband, not the police, nobody. She forgot it entirely. That is the part I need you to hear. When Ruth Vega finally asked her about it in an interview room in 2026, Nora Callahan sat there and said, "I'm sorry, I don't remember. I don't remember him at all. Because people who are kind by default do not remember being kind. It does not stand out to them. It is not an event." That boy's name was Baek Seo-min. He was Seo-jin's younger brother. He was the reason Seo-jin came to this country. And he died 8 months later, in the spring of 2005, in a stairwell on the west side, over something so small that his brother has never repeated it out loud. And in the 8 months between that bakery and that stairwell, Baek Seo-min told his older brother, more than once, that there was a woman on Kedzie Avenue who had fed him when he had nothing, who had not asked his name, and who had not been afraid of him. Seo-jin Baek carried a photograph in his coat for 20 years. It was not a photograph of a woman. It was a bad photograph, taken on a disposable camera by a 19-year-old boy, of the front of a bakery on Kedzie Avenue, with a chalkboard in the window that nobody could read from that distance. So when he pulled a half-frozen woman off the rocks under a causeway in Michigan at 2 o'clock in the morning and looked at her face, he already knew who she was. And when she woke up on the 4th day, he sat in a chair by the door and he told her that she was collateral. He told her she was an asset. He told her that she belonged to him. He said every one of those things so that she would never find out that she was being repaid. Because he understood something about her that her own husband never bothered to learn in 22 years. Nora Callahan would have accepted being a piece of property in a $9 million dispute. She had been property before. She knew how to survive it. What she would never have accepted was charity. And that is why, on the fourth day, when she looked at a man who had just told her she was an asset and asked him whether he had eaten, he had to leave the room. 4 days after the verdict, a black car parked outside a house in Albany Park, and Seo Jin Beck offered Nora Callahan everything. The tower was his now. He had taken it out of the receivership through 3 entities and a bank in Toronto, and it was clean, and it was worth, at that time, something in the region of $60 million, and he told her he would sign it to her. He offered her the buildings. He offered her a name, a real one, with paper behind it, that no court and no reporter would ever be able to open. He offered her protection for the rest of her life, which from that man was not a figure of speech. And underneath all of it, unspoken, in the way that a man like that says the only thing he has ever wanted to say, he was asking her to stay. She said no. And I want to give you her reason in her own words, as closely as I can, because I have thought about this for a long time, and I do not think I can improve on it. She told him, "A man gave me a name once, and a house, and a life, and a company built with my father's money, and I let him hold every bit of it. And by the time I looked up, there was nothing of me left in the room. I am not doing that again. Not with a man who deserves it. Not even with you." And So Jin Beck did not argue. He is, I will point out, the only man in this entire story who ever heard that woman the first time she said something. He opened the car door for her, and he let her go, and he has never contacted her again. She took her father's name back. She is Nora Whitfield now, and she is 51 years old, and if you go to the northwest side of the city of Chicago, to a block on Kedzie Avenue, where there used to be a storefront with a water stain on the ceiling, shaped like the state of Florida, there is a bakery. 6 tables. 4 of them wobble. She is there at 4 in the morning. Every day, not most days. Her daughter works Saturdays, and she is very bad at it. And the 2 of them argue about the register in a way that anybody who has ever worked with their mother would recognize instantly. She writes the customer's name on the box. Every box, every time. And there is one more thing, and then I am going to let you go. Every Thursday evening, about 10 minutes after she turns the sign around, a black car pulls up on the far side of Kedzie Avenue and stops. Nobody gets out. The engine stays running. It sits there for about a minute, sometimes 2, and then it pulls away, and it is gone until the following week. It has been doing this for 2 years. She has never once gone outside to look at it. But every Thursday, before she locks up, Nora Whitfield puts a box on the counter by the door. She writes a name on it, and every Thursday after the car leaves, she throws it away. Because she is not ready, not yet, and she may never be, and that is allowed, and I would ask you to think very carefully before you decide that she owes anybody anything else. But she keeps making the box, and someday, maybe, she is going to open that door. Now, this story is not about a mafia boss. It is not about a tower, or $9 million, or a wedding, or a lake. It is about how quietly a woman can be taken apart, not with violence. There was never any violence in that house in Winnetka. That is the entire point, and it is the thing that people miss. She was taken apart with paperwork, and with charm, and with gratitude, and with 22 years of being told that her opinion would be needed later. And the most frightening thing I can tell you about it is that it never hurts. Not once. She did not feel it happening. Nobody does. You simply look up one day and understand that the room keeps going when you leave it. Nora Whitfield did not get her life back because a dangerous man pulled her out of a lake. She got it back because when the whole thing finally turned, and every dollar and every building and every bit of it was hers to take, she looked at all of it, and she asked for a bakery. So I want to ask you something, and I actually want you to tell me, because I read these. Was she right to walk away from him? Because I know that some of you are sitting there right now thinking that she finally chose herself, and that it took her 51 years to do it, and that it is the best decision anybody in this story ever made. And I know that some of you are thinking about that black car, and that box on the counter, and a woman throwing away bread in the dark for the second time in her life, and you are thinking that she is still punishing herself for something that was never her fault. Tell me which one you are. And there is one more, and I want you to be honest with yourself before you answer it, because it is easy to answer this one out loud, and much harder to answer it at 2 o'clock in the morning. The folder on the desk. The signature that was not hers. 7 months before the lake. Would you have walked out that night? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with me all the way through this, thank you. I mean that. Subscribe, and I will have another one for you soon. Take care of yourself.